not 1941. It's 1958. You hear me? It's 1958.
You're traveling to another dimension. Your next stop, the Twilight Zone.
If there's no music, they can't dance. If they can't dance, they can't kiss. If they can't kiss, they can't fall in love, and I'm history.
What's up, everyone? That particular quote from Back to the Future perfectly summarizes the importance of certain events in time. If you change one seemingly insignificant detail, well, all of history could unravel. With that in mind, today we'll be discussing a Desilu Playhouse presentation of Rod Serling's The Time Element. This show was essentially the true pilot for the Twilight Zone series. And just like Marty McFly struggled to keep himself from fading into oblivion, if the Time Element hadn't been successful, then there may have never been a Twilight Zone.
Well, that's the way it goes.
The Time Element was television's first true glimpse into the fifth dimension. The show originally aired in 1958 as part of Westinghouse Desilu Playhouse, which was an anthology series at the time that mainly featured comedies, dramas, and musicals. Needless to say, this deep dive into sci-fi and fantasy was no easy sell, but we'll come back to that. The Time Element was written by Rod Serling and directed by Alan Reisner. And it's currently floating around right here on YouTube, so if you haven't seen it, check it out first, then head back over here. With that said, spoilers are ahead.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another Westinghouse Desilu Playhouse.
Up front, the most noticeable difference between the Time Element and your typical Twilight Zone is the absence of Rod Serling. Here, we get Desi Arnaz instead. This show was a Desilu production, so it was typical for the charismatic Desi Arnaz to be front and center. And of course, he'd return after the show concluded to tell viewers all about the latest refrigerators. Or at least he tried to.
You can be sure.
That's my line. You can be sure if it's Westinghouse.
The casting in A Time Element is strong. William Bendix stars as Peter Jensen, a short-tempered guy who's very rough around the edges. Peter describes himself as a part-time, unsuccessful bookie, car dealer, and notes that he tended bar nearby. Bendix was a radio, TV, and film actor of the era. He's famous for his role in Life of Riley, and he earned an Oscar nomination for Best Supporting Actor in the film Wake Island.
I keep having this dream. I've had it, 5 or 6 times now.
What sort of dream?
A real one.
When we meet Peter, he's in distress and visiting with a psychiatrist who's played by the legendary Martin Balsam. Balsam, of course, is best known for his role as Detective Arbogast in Psycho. He also appeared in films such as 12 Angry Men, Breakfast at Tiffany's, and The Taking of Pelham 1, 2, 3. Twilight Zone fans will also recognize him from classic episodes The 16mm Shrine, The New Exhibit, and the 80s Twilight Zone segment, Personal Demons. Balsam is excellent here as the soft-spoken Dr. Arnold Gillespie. Dr. Gillespie's chilled-out professional demeanor stands in sharp contrast to Peter Jensen, who's about as blunt as they come.
Nothing shakes you up, does it?
How do you mean?
I mean, everything is calm and cool, and you're the boss.
These two play off each other really well throughout the episode, especially as the story progresses and the Doctor learns more about Peter's bizarre problem.
Did you ever have any wacky dreams that seemed real?
Oh, sure. I guess we all have.
But have they happened over and over again?
So, in his dream, Peter wakes up hungover in the Imperial Hotel in Honolulu, Hawaii. He has no idea how he got there, and to make matters worse, somehow he's lost a month of time. In one of the more awkward scenes, Peter goes on to badger the poor maid over this situation. Let's just say moments like this don't exactly get you on Peter's side in terms of making the lead likable.
What's the name of the place?
What's the name of what place?
This place!
Later, Peter has an even more heated confrontation with the hotel bartender, as played by another familiar face from the Twilight Zone, Jesse White. This bit almost feels like an argument you'd see in a gangster movie right before someone gets whacked.
I'll come behind that bar, and in about 3 minutes, I'll be able to scrape you up in a spoon and put you in a cup.
Let me buy you a drink.
Eventually, Peter is shocked to learn that he's lost way more than a month, because it's not 1958, it's 1941. More specifically, it's December 6, 1941, one day before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor.
It's not 1941. It's 1958.
We get into more traditional Twilight Zone territory when Peter says he believes his experience is more than just a recurring dream.
You're not trying to tell me.
Yes, I am telling you. I'm going back in time.
When it comes to big reveals, I'd say this one ranks up there pretty high. The idea of time traveling via dreams is definitely something that should keep most people hooked. After all, who doesn't love a good time travel story? By this point in the show, it's firmly established Peter isn't the most lovable guy around. But we get even more of an idea just how cold and disconnected he is when his first instinct after realizing he's time traveling is to place shore bets on sports events so he can make a few bucks.
Okay, I'll take $500. Right. What do you mean, how do I know? I just know, that's all.
Now, I don't mean to keep making Back to the Future references, but in this case, how can I resist?
Well, maybe we could place a couple bets.
Marty!
Just when you think this guy has no redeeming qualities, we finally get a hint of humanity. Out of kindness and concern, a young, newly married couple check in on him. Ensign Janoski and his wife Edna, as portrayed by Darryl Hickman and Carol Kearney.
We'll be back about 4 or 5. Maybe you'd like to have a drink with us then if you feel okay, huh?
You got a deal. I remember thinking right at this given moment that these are two nice-looking kids. And while I'm watching them, the thought hits me that this is an awfully young and pretty kid to be a widow after just 2 days of being a wife.
With the looming tragedy finally beginning to weigh on him, Peter takes swift action.
I want a Honolulu newspaper.
And this is a nice development in the story. Up until this point, we've mainly seen Peter give everyone a hard time, so it's refreshing to see he does have a heart.
The Japanese are going to bomb Pearl Harbor tomorrow morning at approximately 8 a.m. Honolulu time.
Peter attempting to warn others, maybe a plot point some could see coming. All the same, I think it works, and has an impact because our protagonist isn't set up as a hero of any sort. I mean, you wouldn't expect the same guy who bullies a poor hotel maid to try to save the day. Nevertheless, Peter does his best to prevent the inevitable, and by doing so, you can't help but root for him.
We're fed up. We've had all we can take for one afternoon. Now you get out of here peacefully, Mr. Jansen.
Unfortunately, the local newspaper editor doesn't believe Peter about the attack, and from there things go completely off the rails.
This is going to hurt me worse than it does you, Mr. Jansen. Believe me.
I believe you, Mr. Gibbons.
Interesting side note, Don Kiefer also shows up around this point, who some of you may recall from another classic Twilight Zone, It's a Good Life.
You think about me. Go ahead, Anthony.
Ultimately, Peter ends up back at the hotel bar, and as he reflects on a tragedy and all of the life that will soon be lost, he begins to lose it.
I'm telling you that tomorrow morning we're going to get attacked. And if you're on that ship...
I'll be on that ship because that's my berth.
In my view, this final scene in a hotel bar is where Bendix really shines.
He may not be alive tomorrow.
This is a true show of raw emotion. Peter's desperate and completely unhinged. No matter how hard he tried, there's nothing he can do to prevent the inevitable.
Let's remember Pearl Harbor as we go to meet the foe.
We revisit the doctor's office, and by now, even the once calm and cool Dr. Gillespie begins to understand the horror of Peter's experience.
It's realistic and very frightening.
What Peter is basically reliving is almost a form of hell. Peter also mentions the dream only hits a certain point, and he fears what will happen when the dream goes even further.
I told you! I told you! Why wouldn't anybody listen to me? I told you!
The doctor tries to apply logic and reason to the situation. He tells Peter that no matter how real all this may seem, his experience must be a dream.
It's not possible to go back in time.
On the surface, it would seem the doctor has reality on his side. However, Peter reveals he actually searched for the Janoski family in real life, and even spoke with Janoski's mother, who told him her son and his new wife were both killed during the attack on Pearl Harbor.
He went down with the Arizona. She was shot down near King Street by a plane strafing.
After hearing this, even the doctor struggles to come up with an explanation. As the time element draws to a close, Peter falls asleep in Dr. Gillespie's office, and once again has the same dream. But this time, his dream does go even further.
I told you! I told you!
We cut back to the doctor's office, and in an eerie moment, we see that Peter has simply vanished. Obviously, the doctor senses something's wrong, but he can't place what it is.
Well, happy dreams.
He then visits a local pub, and wouldn't you know it, he sees a photo of Peter behind the bar.
Well, that's Pete Jensen. He used to tend bar here. He's
dead. He was killed at Pearl Harbor.
So there you have it, The Time Element. On its own, I think this is a solid story with an intriguing and surprisingly relatable concept. Rod Serling places our time-traveling character within the confines of a real-world tragedy. Sadly, no matter what generation you're from, we've all experienced real-world tragedies. But this time travel fantasy at least allows us to imagine the possibility of changing things for the better.
I wasn't kidding this morning. I meant what I said. The Arizona's going to get sunk tomorrow morning.
By putting ourselves in the shoes of Peter Jensen, we too can imagine what we might do to prevent modern disasters. The Time Element features great performances all around, especially from William Bendix. Granted, Peter may not be the most likable protagonist, but some of my favorite television shows such as Breaking Bad, Better Call Saul, and The Sopranos all featured leads who were flawed individuals. If the story is compelling and well executed, then it doesn't matter if a short-tempered guy like Peter Jensen is in the lead. Although, I don't think this guy would agree.
I think he ought to be fitted for a jacket.
You walk on your lower lip one more time, big shot, and I'll get you out of the newspaper business on a disability pension.
From a Twilight Zone fan's perspective, The Time Element is an awesome early glimpse into the fifth dimension. In this one story, we get time travel, blurred lines between dreams and reality, and reflections on war. All topics we'd revisit many times in the classic series. And we even get a traditional Twilight Zone style twist ending, which I loved. As a kid, I recall hearing the idea that dying in your dream could mean you'll die in real life. It was just one of those things kids would tell each other, almost like a spooky ghost story. In The Time Element, the idea is taken even further. When Peter dies in his dream, he's seemingly written out of existence, which is pretty haunting. Speaking of the ending, earlier on I mentioned The Time Element wasn't an easy sell, but that's putting it mildly. According to Mark Scott Zickery's Twilight Zone companion, the ambiguity of the ending was an issue for the sponsors who preferred stories with definitive conclusions. With that in mind, it's no wonder the Time Element script, which Rod Serling had sold to CBS, was shelved and collecting dust. Thankfully, producer Burt Granit and Desi Arnaz saw the potential in this unique tale, and they fought to get it made. The success of The Time Element wasn't only important to Desilu Productions, it was extremely important for Rod Serling. Sure, by the 1950s, Rod Serling was already a highly regarded, Emmy-winning writer. But the problem is, at this point, many of the live anthology series he had written for were going off the air. Also, no matter how successful he was, if he touched on current events or social commentary, his work was altered or flat out butchered by censors. So the world of sci-fi and fantasy was the perfect alternative. If this first step failed, then as I mentioned before, there may have never been a Twilight Zone. Thankfully, after the show aired, critics loved it, and viewers flooded CBS with positive reactions. With that, another pilot, Where Is Everybody, was given the go-ahead, and eventually the Twilight Zone went on to run for 5 seasons. The rest is history.
To the bride and groom.
Long may she wave.
Obviously, The Time Element is another easy one for me to recommend. This pilot almost felt like a lost episode of The Twilight Zone, and it was a pleasant surprise. I'd rate The Time Element 4 out of 5 tough-talking time travelers. That's about it for me. I hope you enjoyed this special episode of the Twilight Zone Review Marathon. If you've seen The Time Element and have your own thoughts on the show, feel free to drop a comment below. And don't forget, if you enjoyed this video, hit like and hit sub. It only takes a second and helps the channel so much. Until next time, stay safe, be well, later.